For 10 years, the NHL handed Gino Odjick the same job every night, and the job was violence. More than 120 fights, more than 35 hours in the penalty box. A franchise record that still stands. The crowd chanted his name. Management counted the ticket sales. Nobody asked what those punches were doing to him, because the answer was already filling his skull. The 50 goals were never coming from Gino Odjick, and everyone in hockey understood that from the start. He was something else entirely, and the man the NHL turned him into only makes sense next to the boy who existed before any of it. He was born on September 7th, 1970 in Kitigan-Zibi, Anishinaabe, an Algonquin community sitting just outside the small town of Maniwaki, Quebec. This was a reserve, not a hockey hotbed, and the rinks he learned on were outdoor sheets of ice that froze hard in the long Quebec winters. His father, Joe, taught him the game out there, coached him as a young defenseman, and the two of them spent hours on the ice the way fathers and sons do when there isn't much else around, and the game becomes the thing that holds them together. There was nothing in that picture that pointed toward violence. He was a kid who could skate, learning from the man who raised him. The number tells you who that man was. For nearly his entire career, Gino wore 29 on his back. And for years, almost nobody knew the reason. It wasn't a lucky number or a tribute to a player he admired. 29 was the registration number the Canadian government assigned to his father Joe when Joe was sent away as a boy to a residential school in Spanish Ontario, where children were stripped of their names and handed numbers. Joe carried that one out of a place built to erase him, and Gino wore it every single night in front of 20,000 people and kept the reason to himself for years. He carried it the way his father had, quietly, as something that belonged to the family and didn't need to be performed for a crowd. He was even assigned 66 at training camp as a nod to Mario Lemieux and wore it in his debut, but the league pushed him off it and he settled into 29 and stayed there. Most fans never thought twice about the digits on his jersey. They had no idea they were looking at a residential school number every time he stepped over the boards. Then came the turn that decided the rest of his life, and it arrived when he was only 15. By then, it was clear he wasn't going to make it as a defenseman. He didn't have the hands or the skating to play that position at a high level, and plenty of kids in that situation simply drift away from the game and go do something else with their teenage years. Gino almost did. He came close to walking away from hockey entirely. Instead, he made a choice that seemed small at the time and turned out to be the hinge that everything else swung on. He decided that if he couldn't make it on skill, he would make it on toughness. He became a fighter. It was around then, playing junior hockey, that someone first hung the nickname on him, the Algonquin Assassin, and it stuck. He couldn't have known what that choice was setting in motion, that he was signing up for 2 decades of damage, because nobody told him. Nobody sat a 15-year-old down and explained what trading punches for a living would do to him by the time he was 50. The question worth holding on to is, who taught the NHL that this was an acceptable bargain? That a kid could buy his way into the league with his fists? The answer isn't about Gino at all. Vancouver answered that question with how they drafted. In 1990, they took Gino in the 5th round, 86th overall, a long way down the list. The kind of pick a team uses on a project or a long shot. But the same draft holds the real tell. With the 18th pick, a first-round selection, they grabbed another enforcer named Sean Antoski, a 6'4" winger who'd piled up penalty minutes in junior. 2 enforcers in 1 draft. This wasn't a team filling out a roster with skill and depth and then maybe adding some muscle as an afterthought. This was a team deliberately stocking up on protection. They wanted bodies who would fight, and they spent real draft capital to get them. The franchise that does that has stopped thinking about a collection of players and started running a plan. But stop here for a second, because Gino's story doesn't make sense without pulling back to look at the machine he was about to be fed into. Through the 1980s and deep into the 90s, the NHL ran on enforcers. This wasn't a fringe element of the game or a few bad apples who couldn't control themselves. It was structural. Nearly every team carried a man whose actual job, the thing he was paid to do, was to police the ice with his fists. If a star got run, the enforcer answered for it. If the game needed a spark, the enforcer dropped his gloves and gave the crowd one. The violence wasn't a breakdown of the system. The violence was the system, working exactly as designed. And Vancouver, as the draft already showed, didn't stop at one. 2 enforcers in a single afternoon tell you how baked in the whole arrangement was. Nobody in a position of power flinched. Gino's rookie year shows what they actually wanted from him, written right there in the numbers. In just 45 games, his first taste of the league, he racked up 296 penalty minutes. That isn't a stat a player accumulates by accident. That's a job description being fulfilled. In his very first NHL game, he fought twice, and those weren't tune-up bouts against nervous rookies. He squared off against Dave Manson and then against Stu Grimson, a man so feared they called him the Grim Reaper, one of the genuinely toughest players of that whole era. A first-game double like that against opponents like those would have been a rough night for a veteran enforcer in his prime. Gino did it in his NHL debut on November 21st, 1990 against Chicago, weeks after being called up from the minors. The crowd loved it, roared for it, and management loved it even more, because the kid they drafted in the 5th round was already paying off. What none of those penalty minutes captured was the real cost. Every punch he threw and every punch he absorbed wasn't just a moment in a fight that ended when the linesman pulled the 2 of them apart. It was a deposit into an account his brain had no idea it was opening, and it never reversed. The damage compounded hit by hit, season by season, while everyone counted goals and penalty minutes instead. There was a question buried underneath the whole enforcer economy that the league never once asked out loud. How long can a human skull keep taking that before something gives way? And what does it say about you that you kept sending men out to find the answer? Odjick's NHL career came to an end not in some marquee bout under the lights, but after a concussion he suffered in a friendly summer hockey game. An almost quiet way for it to be over, given how loud the previous 12 years had been. He was done fighting after that. He hung up the role he'd built his whole life around. But the damage that had been piling up inside him since he was a teenager wasn't done with him. A player can retire. What's already lodged in the brain doesn't retire with him. Then came 2014 and a totally different kind of blow. In June of that year, doctors told him he had AL amyloidosis, a rare and brutal disease in which abnormal proteins build up and attack the organs. In his case, his heart. They gave him weeks. They told a man who'd spent his life as one of the toughest people in professional sports that he had a matter of weeks left to live. And they meant it. What he did next was the most Gino thing imaginable. He refused to go for weeks. He fought the disease for nearly 9 more years, far past every prognosis any doctor had given him. The same stubbornness that had kept him trading punches with men like the Grim Reaper now turned against the thing in his own body. And the whole time, a second story was running underneath the one the public could see. The hits had stopped in 2002, but the harm that repeated head trauma leaves behind doesn't switch off when a man leaves the ice. It progresses. For years, Gino lived with changes to his body and his mind, including stretches of time spent in psychiatric care, struggling with things that didn't have a clear public explanation. From the outside, the headline was heart disease. But something else was moving through him that couldn't be named yet. It couldn't be confirmed because the disease doing it can only be diagnosed for certain after a person has died. So he carried it without a name, and the people around him watched him change without being able to point at the cause. It raises a question the league has never been willing to answer honestly. When does a team's responsibility to a man like this actually end? The day he retires? The day his contract expires? Or does it never really end at all because what he gave them keeps taking from him long after he stopped giving? While Gino was fighting, the NHL was building something, and it wasn't a tribute to him. It was a product. Ticket sales, broadcast deals. The Enforcer era was entertainment, packaged and sold and protected. A reliable way to put bodies in seats and eyes on screens. The fights got their own segments. The tough guys got their own followings. It was profitable, and as long as it was profitable, it was protected. Right up until the rules, the optics, and eventually the lawsuits made it more trouble than it was worth, at which point the league's enthusiasm for it cooled considerably. The men who'd done the actual fighting didn't get a say in that timing. They'd already paid. What was Gino actually doing through all of it, underneath the role they'd assigned him? He was the most loyal man in the building. He named one of his sons Bure, after Pavel Bure, the brilliant Russian superstar he was brought in to protect. The two of them an unlikely pair, the goal-scoring genius from Moscow and the enforcer from an Algonquin reserve, somehow becoming real friends. He wore his father's residential school number to every game he ever played, carrying his family's history into every arena in the league. He was never just a set of knuckles the team deployed when things got rough. He was a man holding on to the people and the history that mattered to him. The whole time, he was being used up. So, the uncomfortable part belongs to the crowd as much as the league. The tickets got bought. The chant of "Gino, Gino" rolled down from the stands until the building shook. And it was real. And the people in those seats loved every second of watching him fight. The question was never whether the NHL knew what it was doing to him. The evidence sat in plain sight, in every dropped glove and every count of penalty minutes. The harder question is how much longer everyone is going to keep pretending they didn't know either. He died on January 15th, 2023, at 52 years old. And after he was gone, it was confirmed. Gino had been living with CTE, the progressive brain disease tied directly and undeniably to repeated blows to the head, the exact thing he'd been paid to absorb for the better part of 2 decades. The league that profited from his fists, that drafted him to fight and cheered when he did, never paid him back for what it cost him. The bill came due inside his own skull, and he was the only one who ever had to settle it. There was something building inside him that the crowd could never see, growing quietly while the arena roared his name, and now the whole of it sits in plain view. The number stitched across his back was never just a number, and the price of every cheer ran far higher than anyone in that building cared to admit. If this one stayed with you, a super thanks keeps this channel alive and keeps stories like Gino's getting told. Subscribe so the next one reaches you, because there's another story coming that the game would rather stay buried.